We left off yesterday talking about some of the crises or the panics that came. We might call them growing pains, right? Our economy is growing really rapidly. We've talked about how we're going to overtake the British and the Germans and so on. But there are definitely challenges. So in the 1870s and then more acutely in 1883 and again in 1893, we have a series of what are called panics. But especially the panic of 1893 was so significant that if we hadn't had like the actual Great Depression, they would have called the Panic of 1893 and the aftermath of that the Great Depression, because we had unemployment rates that skyrocketed. Some got close to 20% in various areas. At one point, a group of farmers who had many of them had like lost their land because they defaulted on their mortgages. They marched. They're called Coxey's Army, C-O-X-E-Y. Coxey's Army is going to, I lost my marker, march all the way to Washington, D.C., where they demand Congress create a jobs program to provide some relief for those who were struggling. They were unsuccessful. Congress basically told them to go away. But there was an incredible amount of tension that surrounded it. So the causes of all of these panics were really pretty similar in that it was all about overcapitalization. What happens is, Andrew's pretty smart, and so he decides he's going to build this railroad but between these two particular towns. We can say like Chicago and Philadelphia or whatever. And he is making a whole bunch of profit. So here comes Maya, and she's looking at all this profit that Andrew's making, and she's going, I could make some of that money too. So she gets a loan from the bank, and then she builds another railroad line that's going to serve the same two cities. But they're still doing well because there's a lot of business. They're both industrializing. They're growing. They're doing great. They're still making profit. So here comes Kathleen, and she thinks she's going to do the same thing. So she goes ahead. She gets a bank loan. She builds the railway line. She gets some business. Now they're all doing pretty well. Not quite as well as before, but they're making plenty of profit. Everything's going great. Here comes Drew back there. He's going to say, you know what? I think I could make some of that money. He gets a loan for himself. He builds another railroad. You can see where this is going. Slowly, their profit margins begin to decrease until, Hannah, she ruins everything. Hannah comes. She decides that she wants a piece of pie. She gets a bank loan. She builds a railroad. And all of a sudden, there's not enough business for all 5 of those railroads. Maybe there's a little hiccup in the economy anyway. Maybe there's a drought and there are fewer crops that are being transported or whatever it is. All of a sudden, these 5 railroads, none of them has enough business, and they each fail. But don't worry, because this part's believable. Spencer is waiting in the wings. He was born wealthy. He's got a big railroad company elsewhere, and so he just waits for them each to fail. And then because they're absolutely desperately poor and they have to be able to feed their families, they're willing to sell their investments to him for pennies on the dollar. He buys all of those railroads up, consolidating his holdings, and now Spencer owns essentially a monopoly in the area. And after this panic or recession is over, he'll be able to make significantly more money by offering a whole bunch of different times of trains leaving the station on his 5 tracks that he now owns. So this is a pretty common phenomenon. It's not just about the railroad industry, but it happens in many industries. Too much is built too quickly because the profits seem exceptional. And then when the market flounders a little bit because of a drought or because of international commodity prices or whatever, we have this big problem. So let's talk a little bit more about Andrew Carnegie. We talked about him yesterday, but I want to tell you a few more stories about him. So one of them we're going to get into more detail later, but it's called the Homestead Strike. And we'll talk about unions later. But a whole bunch of his workers are really upset. What's happened is the price of steel has gone down at this time. And Carnegie believes that his workers are really just one of many factors of production. They're just like the coal or iron ore. If you're copying from the screen, you're not helping yourself. So he thinks that workers are just part of the factors of production. They're like coal or iron or the transportation costs. They're just one more factor. And so he decides that just like he's not willing to pay as much for coal, for example, when business is slow because he doesn't need it as badly, he decides that he's not going to be willing to pay as much for labor either. So he cuts wages because steel prices have gone down. Well, his workers are upset. They say, we're still producing the same quality steel. We're working the same hours. We're doing the same, job. Why are you going to cut our wages just because you're losing a little bit of profit? It seems to them like Carnegie could stand to lose a tiny bit of profit to enable to them to be safe, but he doesn't. He cuts their wages, so they're going to have this big strike, which they organize. Well, Carnegie goes on vacation to Scotland, leaves it all in the hands of his manager, and sort of is seen as like thumbing his nose, like he doesn't care about the plight of his workers. As Carnegie gets older, he continues to use his business savvy to keep control of the steel market, driving steel prices down while also increasing quality, which is pretty good for the country, right? I mean, would we have been able to industrialize as well if steel prices had been higher or the quality had been lower? No, it's excellent for not just for Carnegie, but for all the different industries and the consumers of the United States that Carnegie is doing all of this. He also tends to be pretty familiar with various politicians. So when Carnegie needs to get a license for a particular railroad he wants to build, or needs to get clearance to buy up a particular plot of land or whatever it is, he knows exactly who he needs to shake hands with and, let's be honest, give a little donation to in order to get things done. Meanwhile, Carnegie is also an incredible philanthropist. So Carnegie is going to donate, in his lifetime, a little over half of his profits to various causes. One of his favorite causes are libraries. He loves the idea of donating and purchasing or building libraries for communities because, in his mind, a library is going to allow the best and the brightest, no matter how poor they are, to improve themselves, to educate themselves, to become better, to move up the ranks. Remember, he came to this country as a dirt poor immigrant from Scotland, so he thinks that anybody who really wants to can become as wealthy as he can. So he donates all these libraries. People write to him and they need a new organ for their church, and he buys them an organ for their church. Carnegie Hall, I'm sure you've heard of it. Another gift of Andrew Carnegie to help promote the education and the arts and all this business. So he's really philanthropic at the same time he's cutting people's wages. And anyway, so at the end of his career, this is nothing important for history, but I just think it's a fun story. Carnegie is beginning to get a little older. He, takes more time off than he had before. There are rumors going around that Carnegie might be ready to retire. He doesn't think he's ready for retirement, but some people think maybe he's ready to retire, to give up control of Carnegie Steel and to move on. So another really important guy you should know, this guy named J.P. Morgan. You've heard of J.P. Morgan? Yeah, and Chase. And what's that, J.P. Morgan and Chase? It's a bank, right? So J.P. Morgan, he's not in charge of an industry like Carnegie was. Carnegie was a steel guy, right? J.P. Morgan's industry is money. He's a financier. His business is in gathering capital and buying businesses, and then selling them again or selling them off as pieces, making loans to people and profiting from the interest. That's what J.P. Morgan does. So J.P. Morgan, who is also incredibly successful at his job, decides that he wants to make Carnegie an offer. So he sends a messenger boy, a courier, over to Carnegie's offices, basically to tell him that Morgan is interested in buying the company. And Carnegie receives a messenger boy, is totally dismissive. Remember, old people don't like to be told they need to retire, right? So he is not really ready for this. So he sort of literally tears off the scrap paper. I can't remember now if it's from a newspaper or a notebook he had, but it's like scratch paper. He tears off this scrap of paper and he jots down on it $480 million. 480,000,000. He hands it to the boy and says, "Give this to Mr. Morgan." And so the courier, runs back to J.P. Morgan and hands him, says, "This is what Mr. Carnegie said to give you." And J.P. Morgan looks at it, literally takes out his checkbook, and writes a check, $480 million, puts it in an envelope, hands it back to the courier, says, "Take this back to Carnegie." And that is how Carnegie Steel ends up being owned by J.P. Morgan and other financial officials. So for some context, that's about $13.6 billion today with a B. So don't you think that would be nice if you could just write a check for $13.6 billion at a second thought? Sounds pretty exciting to me. No big deal. Right, yeah, I think that's pretty good context. So, in any case, all of this is to give you context for this question of when we look at these big industrial giants, people like Andrew Carnegie or J.P. Morgan or John Rockefeller, but there are others, Jay Gould, Morgan. Anyway, when we look at them, are they robber barons? Are they bad people who take advantage of the United States and for their own profits and sort of wheedle their way into too much influence? Or are they captains of industry? Like, they're just really gosh darn good at their jobs, and they manage to get things that nobody else can manage to make work, and so therefore they deserve every penny they've got. And there's a lot of debate about it. Here is the cartoon that really starts the idea of robber barons. So this is the little end set. You can see there's some like wealthy looking people and some serfs and a castle. This is like Middle Ages stuff. So here's the big cartoon, and the bottom says, history repeats itself. The robber barons of the Middle Ages and the robber barons of today. So I'm going to turn off the lights so you can see a little bit better all of the words written on the big part of the cartoon. So who are the new robber barons? What does it say on their sashes? Trusts. Trusts. Now, you can, I think, still write while we're talking here, even if it's a little bit dark. A trust is a word that refers to a kind of business organization. You can put next to it in parentheses the word monopoly. They're not quite the same thing, but they kind of work the same way. Have you ever heard of someone who's a so-called trust fund baby? You've heard that phrase? It's definitely in Hamilton. So there's that. Well, the idea of someone who's a trust fund baby is the notion that like maybe their grandparents who were very wealthy, and so their grandparents set aside some money in a trust. And what that means is that it's not particularly wise to give your 15-year-old grandchild access to a large amount of money, right? You can imagine that would go poorly, the kinds of bad choices 15-year-olds make. So instead, they would put this large amount of money in a trust. And so although the money officially belongs to, who wants to be a wealthy, pampered child? Drew, great. Although the money officially belongs to Drew, he can't actually control it until he gets old enough. So instead, while he's young, while he's a minor, there's going to be a board of trustees. You've heard of that phrase before? A group of people, business leaders, people that your grandparents might have trusted, financial advisors, whatever. A board of trustees who are actually in control of the money. So if Drew wants some money, he has to go to the trustees and say, hey, I'm applying to college. I need, I need some checks for whatever, for the application fees, or I need my tuition paid, or I've got to buy a new computer. Can you write a check for this? And the board of trustees has to approve each of those like payments, right? They're officially in charge. Does that make sense? Nod your heads. Okay, so now a trust in the context of the Gilded Age isn't like having money for a spoiled 15-year-old, but instead it's a group of people who control a pool of money. And they use that money to buy companies. Now, the companies continue to exist, but now this board of trustees is officially in charge. So let's say Spencer is a member of one of these trustees. He uses the trust to buy up, Andrew and Maya and Kathleen and Drew and all these railroads. Do those 5 independent railroads still exist? No, they do. Officially, there's still Andrew's Railroad and Maya's Railroad and so on. They have their own signs, their own, like uniforms for the employees, whatever. They still technically exist. But if they're all owned and therefore controlled by the same trust, do they effectively operate as separate companies? Effectively, he can run them as one, right? He can use them, he can set prices the way that he wants to. There is no competition. Even though 5 separate companies technically exist, effectively they're operating like a monopoly. So that's why I told you to put monopoly kind of in parentheses. Because when you hear the word trust with respect to the Gilded Age, that's what you need to think about. So these are big businessmen, right, who own these trusts and thereby control vast parts of industry. And what is their, like war banner? What is the way that they get more power and control? Yeah, war, tariff, and monopoly. So that they are going to use the arm of government to get more power and more control. And their weapon of choice? Legislation, right? The legislation. So reminding us that when you have bazillions of dollars, when you can write a $14 billion check, without a second thought, I don't imagine it would be too difficult for you to get congressmen to do what you want, right? They have a lot of influence in government. So who are the people who are offering tribute to them here? This guy has a bag. Can you read it? Yes, citizens tax. So again, we're taxed, and we have to pay the government our tax money, but then the government supports these guys. How about all these little bags? Can you read? It says wages. Wages. So the people's wages are offered as tribute, right? You don't get paid as much as you ought to be paid because these trusts, these robber barons, control your job and control everything about you. Over here, here's a farmer guy. It says interest on mortgaged farm. Remember, these trusts are heavy in the world of finance. They're going to have significant stake in banks, which raise interest rates to try to get more money out of mortgages across the country. So this is one conception of who these industrial leaders are. But maybe it's not a perfect picture. Because as we've talked about, there definitely is a lot of philanthropy, right? It's not just Carnegie, although he's one of the most well-known examples. Most of these industrialists tended to be strong philanthropists. They liked to, make a name for themselves by giving big donations. Rockefeller and Rockefeller Center, right? There are lots of examples like that. And then, this is a look more at Rockefeller, and although the cartoon that you can kind of see over here on the left, Standard Oil Company has all these arms, and what are they wrapping around? Yeah, savings bank, smaller oil companies. There's a railroad there. My graph is in front of it, but over here in that corner where the graph covers, it's also wrapped around the White House. So there is this sense that Standard Oil has a lot of influence, a lot of control all over the place, which is shown here as bad. But look at the graph itself. What does the graph show? The prices of oil is going down. Rockefeller is going to argue that he deserves to have his monopoly. He deserves to be in so much control because it reduces the price. Think about it. If you have 5 different companies that are running oil or getting oil and processing it and all this business, well, you've got to have infrastructure for 5 different plants. You're going to have inefficiencies and redundancies, several different business managers, several different engineers, whatever it is. But if you have just one company that does all of that, well, think of the efficiency. You could reduce redundancy. You could have just one employee to serve all 3 of those, or 4 or whatever. You can share resources like share rail lines or share pipelines. You can see that there is some truth to the idea that having one person do it all is pretty efficient, if they're doing an okay job. So Rockefeller is going to argue that, in fact, he's doing the country a service. And it's hard to argue with him because over the course of time, as the price of oil drops, that not only reduces costs for other industries, right? So if you're the railroads, if you're another factory who uses oil to power like your new engines or whatever it is, it's good for them. But it's also good even for the poor who need to buy kerosene, which is an oil product, to light their houses in the evening to improve their quality of life. So maybe these big industrial leaders are captains of industry. Maybe they're, ruthless because they have to be, and they help to build up our economy and make us the greatest nation in the world. What do you think? Yes, a mixture? Yeah, generally in history, the answer is going to be both, right? The answer is that there's a little truth to both sides, but you can understand how the two visions, right? If you believe that trusts are captains of industry, you might want your government to act in a certain way. And if you believe that the trusts are robber barons, then you would argue for something different. So we'll have to keep that in mind as we move into the progressive era. Here's a cartoon that was on the AP exam in the first year it came out, so 2 years ago. I'll let you look at it for a bit. It's at the bottom. It says the protectors of our industries. The water here says hard times. Ooh, I can do my magic trick. So there it says hard times. Over here, all of these are labeled linen workers, $11 a week. Lumber workers, $6 a week. Leather workers, $7 a week. Paper workers, $6 a week, and so on. Do you see that? What does that remind you of? Minecraft. Good job. Of course it's Minecraft. What else? Maybe Gold Rush. Hammer and sickle, anyone?
Communism.
Okay, these guys up here. Sage, Gould's millions, Field's millions, Vanderbilt's millions. Their bodies themselves are actually money bags. That's kind of interesting. Would you work together with your partner and see if you can brainstorm what is the message of this cartoon? If we just sum it up in a sentence, what is the cartoonist trying to say? Go. So the title is The Protectors of Our Industries. Who are the protectors? The common people, right? The workers themselves. If we think that they're captains of industry, perhaps the elite, these big industrialists might say that they themselves were the protectors of our industry. But this cartoon says, no, it's not them. So who thinks they can sum this up in a sentence or so? You were all doing a great job just a minute ago. All right, Spencer, what does it say? What does it mean? Did you just raise your hand and now you want Caroline to say it? Sorry, what? The poor hold up the wealthy. Sure. Okay, Drew.
Without like the common people, like with everything, like the success of the millionaires is protected and built off of the common.
All right, sure. That it's the common people who are doing really the heavy lifting, literally, in this case, to keep the economy going. Sure. So that they absorb the hard times, right? Like Carnegie lowers wages, but to protect himself from hard times. So as all of this goes on, we begin to see the rise of unions. Now, unions existed earlier during the market revolution of the 1820s and 30s, but they're not anywhere near the scale that we're talking about during the Gilded Age. So these unions are going to begin to organize, and there are various branches of unions. First, we've got, and these are all important, first we've got the Knights of Labor. They're one of the earliest unions. And the Knights of Labor are going to have this radical idea that if we organize everyone, right? The skilled workers, the unskilled workers, immigrant workers, women, blacks and whites, if we organize everyone, that's going to give us more power, right? Because if we threaten a strike, we're going to have more influence. There's going to be more people who are going to go on strike. The companies are going to be more afraid of us if we organize more workers. Any thoughts about how it's going to go down? Why not well? Okay, so it's hard to organize all those people, but especially because they include both skilled and unskilled, who are replaceable? Unskilled laborers, right? Unskilled laborers are really replaceable because you can literally just hire someone off the boat, these new immigrants arriving daily, and you're going to be fine moving on. It's easy to break strikes when the predominant people upholding the strike are these unskilled laborers. So the Knights of Labor are going to have a lot of problems because it's really just difficult for them to get anything accomplished, because it's not that hard for businesses to simply fire all the workers who are striking and just fill them up again. And of course, as we continue to industrialize, do we tend to have more skilled or more unskilled jobs? Way more unskilled, right? The more technology advances, the more unskilled jobs, right? Like these days, it used to be that if you worked in a car manufacturing plant, that you had a really, really good job, right? Because it took a lot of skill to be able to put together the engines just right to do all of those things. These days, robots do that job, right? So there are a few people who still work in car manufacturing plants who do get paid well because they are the masters of all this technology. But you can't get hired as a entry-level car manufacturer worker because there aren't any of those jobs. They're just replaceable. They don't need you. They're not going to pay you very much for that. So as technology advances, we see more and more unskilled jobs because the technology, the machines, replace skilled workers. So now anybody, even with no training at all, can come in and replace a bobbin 500 times a day on his textile machine. Whereas before you had to have someone who actually understood the process of weaving, for example, or understood the way that the thread interacted. Now, it's literally just replacing the thread. The machine does all of the work. So unions are going to grow, and they're addressing things like near stagnant wages. So wages are rising, but very slowly. The average wage around 1880 was about $450 a year. $450 a year, which is up from about $200 a year, 20 years before. So we have seen significant wage growth, but it still costs about $600 a year for a decent living. Like to have a safe, apartment that has actually space for you, to have decent quality food, to be able to provide medical care when it's necessary, those kinds of things. So sure, things are better, but not nearly well enough. Injury rates are incredibly high. 1 in 20 Americans, or 1 in 20 industrial workers, could expect to be significantly injured on the job, as in permanently injured, like missing limbs or deformities or injuries that prevent them from walking correctly or whatever it is. And 1 in 200 could expect to die on the job. Casualties of labor, things like women who would get their hair caught accidentally in spinning machines and would be basically decapitated in the process, or men in steel mills who would fall into like molten metal and be killed. Meat processing plants where there's lots of sharp moving parts to grind up the meat. Again, people getting trapped in those machines and then getting sort of ground up. So it's a dangerous time to be a worker, and they're seeking some sort of organization. We also want to remember that a fairly significant number of men are now facing competition from women and children. So about 20% of the workforce is made of women. Companies, factories want to hire women because they can pay them lower wages. And about 10%, this is a different statistic, about 10% of girls, that is age 13 and under, are employed. And about 20% of boys, this time age 14 and under, are employed. So that's a pretty large number of children in this country, really little kids who are working. And that means, of course, that they are in unsafe conditions. They're not getting an education. It's really detrimental for those young people and the way that they're growing up. So we've talked about the Knights of Labor, and we can sort of predict they're not going to have a whole lot of success. So after a while, we see the rise of another union organization called the AFL, which stands for the American Federation of Labor. The American Federation of Labor decides that the best thing is to get rid of all of those unskilled workers. Leave them to themselves. They can't be helped. But the AFL attempts to organize skilled workers only. So machinists, craftsmen, people who are much less easily replaced. So they're going to focus on skilled workers. Oh, of course, and only white men as well. So skilled workers, white men only. And over time, we see some other unions. The third union that you really need to know, like specifically, also comes about the same time. It's the ARU, the American Railway Union. This one is led by somebody we're going to hear a lot about, Eugene V. Debs. V. So some of the students read that and they think it's a court case, but it's not. Just his middle initial is V. So Eugene V. Debs. He's going to run for president several times, including once from prison. So he'll become a founder of the American Socialist Party. Anyway, big things coming from Eugene V. Debs. So, but the thing is that unions really struggle to be successful. And so we're going to pick up, we're not done for today, but we're done for story time for today. We're going to pick up tomorrow with a little bit of information about what happens when strikes begin. How do the strikes turn out, and what does that mean for the country?